Now we're going to be graphing some quadratics in something called vertex form. And so let's just do a little bit of review on how we graph different kinds of equations, right? So if we have a linear equation, we know the graph is going to be a line. Let's say we have y equals 2x plus 1. In order to graph this, we might have some fancy tricks, but really we can just take a bunch of numbers for x and just plug them in, right? So we'll take our x value of -1, we'll plug it into x. We get y equals 2, multiply -1 plus 1. We can put that all in the calculator and we get -1. So there's our first point, -1, -1. We take that 0, plug it into x. Also, we plug in each one. When you plug in 0, we get 1. When you plug in 1, we get 3. When you plug in 2, we get 5. So that gives us our line. And so how can we graph exponentials? Well, same thing, right? We can just take a bunch of points, plug them in. When you plug in -1 into the x, y equals 2 to the -1. When we have a negative exponent, we put it on bottom. It gives us 1/2. So same thing for exponentials. We just plug in a bunch of points and see what we get. When you plug in 0, we're going to get 1. When you plug in 1, 2. Plug in 2, we get 4. So -1, 1/2, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 4. So for any graph we ever have, we can just plug in a bunch of points. So let's do that for some quadratics. And so the main / base quadratic function that we're going to graph and use is y equals x squared. Okay, and so same thing as before. We're just going to take points and plug them in. So let's plug in -1, let's plug in 0, let's plug in 1. We take y equals, when you plug in the -1 into the x, make sure that -1 is in parentheses. -1 squared, put that in the calculator, we get +1, -1, 1. We plug in the 0, we get y equals 0 squared, that is 0. We plug in the 1, and we get y equals 1 squared, which is 1. And so the graph of a quadratic will always be this shape. Sorry, I'm using my mouse, so my drawing's terrible. Okay, so that shape. And we have some vocab here that we need to know. So the first thing is the vertex. The vertex is that point right there. So that's like the middle point of it, vertex. And the vertex for our base graph is always going to be at 0, 0. Okay, that says 0, 0. I know that might have a thing blocking it, but the vertex is at 0, 0. Okay, so that's the vertex. Another vocab word is the axis of symmetry. The axis of symmetry is just a line that goes straight up and down through the vertex, that it cuts the parabola in half. In this case, it happens to be on the y-axis, but that's the axis of symmetry. And then a parabola is the actual graph itself. So like the graphs of quadratics are called parabola. So that is a parabola. Okay, so we just basically plug in a bunch of points to graph this, no problem. But what if when you plug in a bunch of points, you only end up graphing part of the parabola? And so like what do I mean by that? What if like for this graph, instead of plugging in -1, 0, 1, what if you only plugged in like 0, 1, 2, right? Because that means your graph would have looked like this only. And this kind of looks like an exponential. It doesn't have both parts, so it's kind of incomplete, right? It doesn't really give us a good idea. And so we need a way to avoid this, right? So we actually get all parts of it. And so the way that we do this is we're always going to find the vertex first, and then we're just going to plot 2 points around it. Okay, so once again, we're always going to get that vertex first. We need to know where the vertex is, and then we just plug in points around it. And so let's graph a couple. And so remember, the base graph y equals x squared, it's at 0, 0. Okay, and so for each of these, we're going to graph using the vertex and 1 point. So if we have y equals x squared plus 1, since it's x squared, we know that it's going to be this shape. Okay, and so when we have plus 1 on the outside of the x squared, what that does is it moves the vertex up 1. So remember, it's originally at 0, 0, moves up 1, so it's going to be at 0, 1. So that's our vertex. And then, since you want the points around it to make it look like that, what are the points around the number 0? -1 and 1. So we're going to take those and plug it into the x. So we get y equals -1 squared plus 1. You can put this in the calculator. That gives us 1 plus 1, which is 2. negative 1, 2. We plug in the 1 also, you will get 2 again. So there is our parabola. And so just for now, we're going to have the vertex and 1 point on each side, and then we'll get to more specifics in the next couple days. So when we have y equals x squared minus 1, that is going to move the vertex down 1 to 0, negative 1. So that's our vertex here, and once again, we plot 1 point on each side. The numbers next to x are negative 1 and 1. We plug those in. Negative 1 squared minus 1 is 0. We plug in the 1 into the x. 1 squared minus 1 is also 0. There are the 2 points. There is our parabola. When we have x plus 1 squared, so this time the plus 1 is inside of this exponent right next to that x. So when it looks like this, that's going to move the graph left 1 to negative 1, 0. Negative 1, 0, so that's our vertex. And so what are the points next to negative 1 that we want to plug in? That's going to be negative 2 and 0. Negative 2 and 0. So once again, we plug those in. We'll plug in the negative 2 into the x. We get y equals negative 2 plus 1 squared. Negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1 squared, and that gives us 1. We plug in the 0. We'll get the same number, 1. There is our parabola. Lastly, when you have x subtract 1 squared, that moves it to the right one. Always does. Right 1, 1, 0. Once we do that, we plug in the points around it. What are the points around it? 0 and 2. 0, 1, 2. We plug in the 0. Y equals 0 minus 1 squared. That's negative 1 squared, giving us positive 1. We plug in the 2. We also get 1. And there is our final parabola. Thank you for listening.